Thank you, everyone, for joining this talk, moving away from exploit kits, the current state of DriveBy download. My name is Krishnan Subramanian, and I am a security research engineer at a startup called Menlo Security. So a little bit introduction about myself before we delve into the content. I've been for roughly 8 years in the field of cybersecurity, doing security research, threat intelligence, and a little bit of experience doing incident response as well in the past. And I was able to embark into the journey of cybersecurity through a master's degree in computer forensics from George Mason University. And bulk of my cybersecurity career I have spent on building security products at startups, and currently focused on researching threats and attacks that actually originate from the web and email vectors. And my handle in Twitter is Krish203. Please feel free to hit me up on Twitter. So for today's talk, we're going to be starting off by talking about what is a DriveBy download, what is an exploit kit, and give a brief breakdown of how they function and typical infection chain involved in an exploit kit. Next, we will talk about decline in exploit kit activity over the years and provide a perspective on why this is the case, followed by the core content of the talk, where we delve into the current techniques and mechanisms that are being used by attackers to carry out drive-by download attacks, and conclude this talk with some insight into how to gain visibility and defend against these techniques from a SOC team standpoint. So what are drive-by download? Going by the definition, they are essentially downloads that are triggered by scripts or some sort of an automated mechanism like redirection, and the user doesn't visibly notice the download. And sometimes it is authorized by the user, but actually doesn't understand the consequences. And this point is key because we will see that user interaction is required to execute the download on the endpoint. So revisiting exploit kits. Exploit kits have been around for quite some time now, and they actually date back to 2006. And they had a highly successful run in the years from 2006 to 2012, I believe. And I think the reason for that was because of the sheer number of plugins, browsers used to natively support those days. And these plugins were often marred with, severe vulnerabilities. One point in time, I think in 2012, when Black Hole exploit kit was quite prominent, the infection rates were alarming, and exploit kits usually achieve mass infection rates by using techniques like watering hole or website compromise to actually infect endpoints. And the key differentiator for exploit kits was once the exploit was successful, there was no further user interaction required to execute the final payload on the endpoint. And traditionally, exploit kits are known to drop commodity malware like ransomwares, banking trojans, and crypto miner families, to name a few. So next, let's just quickly talk about the typical exploit kit kill chain. So first, victims visit an infected site through either like a watering hole attack or a compromised website or through a malvertising channel. And the next step would be, a gate URL which acts as a filter where, checks like IP checks or geofences or, time zone based checks are carried out. And next, the users are taken to a landing page where, the browser is analyzed to determine active plugins and their versions, and if there are any vulnerable plugins that can be exploited. And the next step is to actually trigger the exploit. And upon successful exploitation, a malicious payload is delivered to the endpoint and executed within the context of the browser process itself. And lastly, most exploit kits usually come with an administration or a management interface, which lets exploit kit authors track statistics like number of exploit kits that have been successfully infected, IP blacklisting, and also managing the different exploit payloads that will be delivered after a successful exploitation. So why are we seeing a decline in exploit kit activity? Firstly, back in the days, Internet Explorer was shipped along with the Windows operating system and did not have security features like process separation or sandboxing, meaning any successful exploitation of vulnerabilities in plugins that the browser used to support back in those days could give access to execute malicious code within the context of the browser process itself. Fast forward today, Google Chrome and other modern browsers have security features like process separation and sandboxing. Secondly, I think signaling end of life for some of the old browser plugins, like Silverlight and Java applets are no longer supported. And more recently, Adobe Flash was end of life, I believe, either end of December 2020 or January 2021. And I think that's another contributing factor for decline in exploit kit activity. The other angle is why not exploit kit authors take advantage of zero-day browser exploits. I think it's mainly because of the complexity, and it's very expensive for exploit kits to drop commodity malware using browser 0 days. For example, if there is a Chrome 0 day that is exploited on a Windows endpoint, it allows them to break out of the process sandbox, but the exploit needs to be chained with another OS vulnerability to be able to carry out remote code execution. And two examples, that said, there is evidence of browser 0 days being used by more sophisticated actors like APT and the nation state groups. A couple of examples. There was an off-the-record talk by the Coinbase incident response team in B-Sites SF 2020, where they spoke about responding to Firefox 0 days in the wild. And more recently, there was another campaign that was targeting the security researcher community by leveraging IE and Chrome exploit chained with some other Windows vulnerabilities. So lastly, drawing some references from the security community, there is a pretty prominent author called Brad or Malware Traffic, who maintains a website, Malware Traffic Analysis, known for its exploit kit related posts over the years. And here from the table, you can clearly see there's been a steep decline in the number of posts on that website related to exploit kits. So I think these are some of the reasons we are seeing the decline in exploit kit activity over the years. So then, what are the current drive-by download mechanisms we are seeing then? Since exploit kits are becoming increasingly difficult to target, modern browsers because of the security mechanisms that are in place, attackers are trying to keep it simple by making use of existing features that are offered within the realm of the HTTP protocol. To draw an analogy, in the Windows environment, over the years, I think fileless attacks with living off the land binaries has become quite prominent. I think there was a great talk just a few hours back, Introduction to Fileless Malware by Juan Araya in the Track 1 series. So drawing that analogy of using, lol bins You can think of HTML5 and JavaScript features as lolbins on the browser, where they are using something that is available within the HTTP protocol and the browser environment to carry out attacks. These are things like are features like the data URLs or blobs, which is defined in the RFC 2397. And using JavaScript to generate blobs that trigger downloads on endpoints. And lastly, the other techniques is using simple technique of iframe plus redirection, which are all again within the browser environment itself. One thing to note is there is no client-side exploitation here. So the first technique that we want to talk about is called HTML smuggling. This is a pretty straightforward technique which makes use of HTML5 and JavaScript features to actually construct a payload entirely on the browser side or the client side. So as you can see from the screenshot here, there is a JavaScript variable that has there is a base 64 encoded variable that is dynamically converted into a blob using JavaScript, and you can see the appropriate MIME type, the octet stream MIME type that is set, which then instructs the browser to trigger download on the client side. And in regards to the browser, in regards to the end user experience, the user will, usually see a save or open dialog prompt for the download, or see the download in the folder location that has been set to download files. I think this depends on how the download settings are configured on the browser. And we just gave this campaign the name Dury because of because it uses the data URI scheme. The second technique is just a slight variation of HTML smuggling, where instead of constructing the payload on the client side and including the base 64 payload within the HTTP response, an additional jQuery XHR get method is being used to fetch the base 64 encoded payload from a remote URL. I think this the reason behind using this technique is the remote URL was acting like a gate, which filters access to the malicious base 64 encoded payload. So if someone were to just visit the link in standalone, then it would return a 404 or redirect the user to some benign sites like downloads.microsoft.com. So the last one is blending the two previous techniques with the iframe redirection mechanism. This technique is pretty similar to what exploit kits use, because exploit kits are known to use iframes for redirecting victims. So this table sort of shows the comparison between a traditional exploit kit iframe redirection mechanism versus what we are seeing with the current drive-by download mechanism. So both of them start with a gate where they have some sort of filter that determines if the browser can proceed to the next step of the attack chain or not. And the next step in an exploit kit infection chain would be to redirect the user to a landing page. But in the current mechanism, we don't have a landing page because there is no exploitation involved. So the landing page is replaced with a redirection chain, which is often hosted on trusted cloud services like Amazon S3 or Bitbucket or Microsoft Azure, Cloudflare, and services like that. And the next step in the exploit kit chain would be to trigger the exploit. But in the current redirection, in the current drive-by download attack chain would be to trigger the automatic download using like a blob or HTML smuggling. And the last step, which is a key differentiator, is there is no user interaction involved in case of an exploit kit, but the current drive-by download mechanism requires user interaction to execute the download. And this is where the whole social engineering tactics come into play, where the attackers are, using fake updates where legitimate software application updates are masqueraded, or coming up with themes like a fake Google Drive share. And these are some of the example themes that we are seeing with these campaigns. One note around browser security improvements around iframes that happened, I believe, last year. Sometime in July, the Chromium and Firefox team has come up with some security controls over sandboxed iframes. So essentially, the sandbox attribute allows web developers to control what actions an iframe can perform, like allowing downloads or running scripts, etc. So the security enhancements that were implemented by the Chrome and Firefox development team mainly protects users against malvertising campaigns that can trigger automatic downloads from sandboxed iframes. So we are seeing that attackers are working around this by avoiding or not using the malvertising channel. Instead, picking a watering hole scenario or common cloud services to plan the iframes, which gives them the flexibility of defining the iframe attributes that they want. And for example, in a specific drive-by download campaign, we observed a sandbox iframe that was hosted on sites.google.com, but the allowed downloads directive was actually set, which allowed the attackers to trigger the download from the context of the iframe. So next, we want to talk about the Sawgullish Framework. The SOC in the Sawgullish stands for social engineering, and this framework primarily targets Windows users, and this framework leverages all the aforementioned techniques, and it is used to trigger and deliver drive-by downloads to the endpoint. Usually, this framework is used to drop ransomware, remote access trojans that end up triggering ransomware infection chain using like standard living off the land binaries. And the downloaded file is usually a zip file that contains like an embedded LNK file or a Windows script file. So we saw on the previous slide, it is known to drop, remote access trojans that can download additional malware like ransomware. In a specific campaign, Sawgullish framework campaign, we observed it was being used to drop, Dridex, which is a well-known remote access trojan, and the Dridex then uses tools like PowerShell Empire to actually load Doppelpaymer, which is a ransomware family. I think it was also used in the recent Kia attacks where they had to pay like around $20 million to remediate the attack. Just to give you an example of what are the themes that the Sawgullish framework uses, like you can see a fake Google Drive share or masquerading of a legitimate Firefox browser update, or fake Microsoft Teams update. These are some of the common themes that we are seeing used by this framework. So what are some of the challenges in detecting this particular class of attacks, right? The first bucket is, the technique of HTML smuggling and blogs, where the payload is constructed on the client side. This makes it quite difficult for network-based solutions that actually rely on HTTP instructional headers to determine file downloads. Second bucket is the usage of social engineering tactics. I think attackers are using wise social engineering tactics in an attempt to defeat detection systems, and hiding behind trusted or known cloud service providers, or masquerading legitimate application updates like Microsoft Teams, for example. The third bucket is the logging visibility aspect of it, right? So currently, the log events on an endpoint for on a Windows endpoint for blob downloads or downloads that originate from the iframes is quite inconsistent and probably even inaccurate. And we will see an example of that in a later slide. And since network solutions have poor visibility into blob-based downloads, there is heavy reliance on endpoint logs, which means the download was probably already executed by the user on the endpoint at that stage. So the Mitre attack perspective, the specific techniques that we spoke about to deliver drive-by downloads have been focused on the initial access phase of the Mitre attack corporate attack matrix. And there could be a specific sub-technique defined for this specific class of drive-by attacks, but this technique 1189 drive-by compromise does not have any sub-techniques defined on the attack portal. And these are some of the suggested logging telemetry that we could collect with specific to this attack: web proxy logs, endpoint logs like the ones that mentioned, which mostly applies to the post-download execution phase. So we briefly spoke about the discrepancy in logging. So I just took a simple example of a sysmon event log that gets generated when a blob-based file download happens on a browser in a Windows endpoint. In the first case, you can see that the legacy edge is actually does a good job at populating the right referrer URL value where the domain from which the blob was served is known, and also the host URL indicates that it was a blob. But surprisingly, more modern browsers like the Chromium-based Edge and any Chromium-based browsers are not reporting the referrer URL and the host URL values correctly. You can see it's like about client and about internet, which is kind of a little vague when somebody is trying to connect the dots in a drive-by download attack. So how can we enhance logging visibility? One approach would be to use extensions to detect drive-by downloads. I think this is a debatable topic because there has been a lot of security and privacy concerns around browser extension. Again, there was a great talk in BSET SF 2020 by, I think, the security team at Lyft, where they talk about Chrome extension risks. And extensions are not browser agnostic. There is no single extensions that can work on across different browsers. So I think the solution would be to have a consistent download event log reporting across different browsers, which can then be leveraged by standard endpoint, logging tools like Sysmon or OSQuery, where the additional context or the metadata around the download is reported accurately. With that, I think we have reached to the conclusion. Some of the key takeaways are, using a very layered security approach is probably helpful. Having logging telemetry across the different layers, where each time user visits a website from the time the drive-by download gets to the endpoint, that is before the execution. Secondly, creating social engineering awareness of watering hole attacks and the common themes that are being used by these campaigns. I think GoFish is a great open source tool that could potentially be customized to used for creating awareness about such class of attacks. And lastly, for red team and blue teams, it might be useful for red team to include these specific techniques in their tool arsenal. And blue teams can probably come up with a playbook on defending and getting more visibility into this specific attack chain. With that, that brings us to the end of the presentation, and would be happy to take any questions.
So thank you very much for that, Krishnan. It was very insightful, very informative. I don't think we have any questions. I'm just going to check now. No, there's no questions there.
Okay.
So yeah, I think we'll wrap it up then, if that's okay. So thank you very much for taking the time to do your talk today. It's greatly appreciated, and it's very interesting talk as well. So thank you very much again for that.
Thank you everyone for the time. It's truly been an honor speaking at this B-Sides Dublin event, and I would like to thank the B-Sides Dublin team for giving me this opportunity to present. Please do hit me up on Twitter or LinkedIn if there are any questions. Please take care and stay safe. Thank you.